When you are a hyperactive kid, and I don't know if there are any are there any hyperactive people here tonight? Am I alone in this crowd? Just let me hear you. You're always heard anyway. If you're a hyperactive person, you don't need much sleep, and especially when you're a kid. Because that's a good 8 hours you could be partying down in the house when everybody else is asleep. I mean, that's good time, and it just don't need it. My dad, though, had a very special way of getting me to bed. He would tell me and my brother bedtime stories. And we loved my dad's bedtime stories. He didn't find them in magazines. He didn't read them in books. He made them up out of his quiet imagination. Every night at 9 o'clock, my brother and I lived for bedtime. Because we knew, sure enough, at 9 o'clock, Daddy was going to tell us a bedtime story. We would run to our bed. We'd pull the sheets up to our eyes. I told Mike, you see, we each had separate beds, and I told him, though, we'd better sleep together. When we were little, we slept together because I told him one night somebody might try to kidnap us. Mama heard me tell him that. She said, Mark, don't worry about it. If they kidnapped you, they'd have you back before morning. But we'd run to our bed, we'd wait on Daddy, and sure enough, every night at 9 o'clock, that hairy arm would reach around the doorpost and turn out the light. And Dad bought a skull that glowed in the dark. And that skull would peek around the doorpost, come floating into the darkness. It would float over to our little bed. It would look down in our little eyes. And Daddy would say, long ago and far away, there were two little boys named Mike and Mark. And I'd go, that's us. And Daddy'd tell some scary story that'd make the hairs on the back of your neck break dance. I mean, it'd be a killer of a story. And we were always in them. He didn't read them in books. He didn't get Jane and Jack to be the leading characters. Mike and Mark were the heroes of my dad's stories when we were kids. And no matter how scary it got, didn't bother us. Because we knew at the end we was going to win. Because we knew who was telling the story. We knew no matter how slimy, how greasy, how ugly the monster was that was chasing us down the haunted corridors of the Ooey Castle. We knew at the end we were going to turn on him and zap him blind and stupid. Because Daddy was telling the story. And you know, it really reminds me a lot about our Heavenly Father, because you know, He is telling this story. And it don't matter how scary it gets. Just read the last chapter of the book. We win. He'd tell those scary stories, and we loved them. We didn't want lilacs and springtime children. We wanted scary. And then before we'd fall asleep, Daddy'd tell us another story. He'd tell us about Jesus. And he could put that on a 4- and 6-year-old level, too. He told us when Jesus was on this earth, he was a poor man, according to the world's standards. Never owned a house. Never drove a car, which blew my mind. But come to find out later, no one drove cars back then. I just didn't know it. Daddy told us even when it came time for Jesus to pay his taxes, he had to go fishing. But Jesus had something that money couldn't buy. And he was always passing that out. Daddy said Jesus passed a crippled boy one day. He couldn't afford a wheelchair. So he just gave that boy new legs. Jesus passed a blind kid. He couldn't afford a seeing eye dog, so he just gave that kid new eyes. Jesus passed a demon-possessed man. He couldn't afford psychiatric counseling. So he just cast those devils out and gave that man a sound mind. Jesus passed a funeral. Now this is where it gets good. You know, Jesus was the greatest preacher who ever lived, and he never preached a funeral. He raised the dead. And folks, when the dead sit up, the funeral is over. We can all go home. We don't drop dead first. But the Lord touched that dead girl's cold, lifeless hand. And you know the story. When he touched her hand, her cheeks flushed. And she sat up.